And then, all of a sudden, across the board banning of permits on all masons, carpenters, and landscapers. This policy and these wide swings in policy has heightened uncertainty. And as we all know, uncertainty is the biggest enemy of business. And because it has heightened uncertainty, it's discouraging business activity and therefore the growth of jobs for Bermudians. Yesterday we celebrated Labor Day, and this really relates to the construction industry in particular and the unemployment situation. You know, there is great dignity in honest work, great dignity. And there's great dignity in the ability to be self-sufficient, to be able to support oneself and one's family and one's loved ones. Unemployment, through no fault of your own, is a blow to that dignity, and therefore destructive, not just to you economically, but destructive to your self-esteem, to your view of yourself as a productive individual. Therefore, it's one of government's roles to endeavor to support what I call sustainable employment among the Bermudian population. It's a natural thing in the business world to have peaks and troughs in economic activity. This thing called the business cycle. I think the last Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK said that their policies were going to make the business cycle a thing of the past. We all know that that hasn't happened, because business cycles are a product of human nature. So we have these peaks and troughs in business cycle. Government's job is to try to smooth those peaks and troughs so that you don't get too overheated in the good times and you don't get too depressed during the bad times. That's, I believe, is a role of government. And during its tenure, this government has only made those peaks and troughs worse. And we certainly are in a deep trough right now, particularly in the construction sector. Now let's move on to public finance. Bermuda has been operating at a current account deficit, and the deficit we discovered during the last session of the Senate questions, that the government deficit was in fact $14 million worse than we were told it was during the budget debate in March. Now, to reach the target set by this year's budget, which is a $67 million surplus, it requires the government to have a positive swing of $134 million in a year. This is based on the background of their tax increase. The tax increase was only $100 million. And I dare say that they probably won't get all of that $100 million because of the increased amount of unemployment. If people aren't working, they don't pay payroll tax. So the yield on that tax increase is likely to be less than expected. So I think that the likelihood of government reaching its targets for this year, particularly if you include repayment or should I say replenishment of the sinking fund and interest, the likelihood of them reaching that target for this year is very low indeed. Now let me return to unemployment for a second, because I think we all know that inflation in Bermuda is low. But even though inflation, which is a rate of increase in prices, even though inflation is low, the cost of living in Bermuda is stubbornly high, remains stubbornly high. And it's very hard for people who are unemployed or underemployed or making a low wage to survive in Bermuda because it is such an expensive place to live. And on top of that, even though we have unemployment and a weak economy, we're still taking more money out of people's payrolls. You know, the payroll tax has gone up, and the deductions for health insurance have also gone up. And the deductions for health insurance seem to be slated to go up at an amazing rate, much, much higher than the rate of inflation. So people's disposable income, all other things being equal, their disposable income is actually declining. It's a very important point to note. Now, just let me recap. I'm sure you'll all be happy to hear that I'm about to stop. Poor to indifferent external conditions are likely to continue for the next 6 months to a year. The payroll tax has made a bad situation worse. I have to say that the Premier mentioned something about why tourism wasn't doing well in Bermuda, and it was somehow doing well in Jamaica. Well, you know, Bermuda is not Jamaica. We cannot bring tourists to Bermuda and house them in almost a fortified enclave like they do in Jamaica. We can't do that. When tourists come to Bermuda, they live among us. And this is a very important point as it relates to the state of crime in this island. I have no hesitation, because I said it before. The biggest threat to our economy in Bermuda is crime. We can talk about economics all you like, but if we continue shooting each other, it poses a major threat to our way of life in this island. We have made some efforts in that regard, but it's clear to everybody that the efforts that we have made so far to curb crime and to make Bermuda safe again have been far from effective. So there is this inextricable link between crime and the economy. Never used to be, or let's put it this way, it was in a kind of benign way before. Everybody thought Bermuda was safe. But we can't put our hands over our hearts and say that anymore. So these chickens will come home to roost. That's the end of my prepared remarks.